Hello everybody, the Necromancer sets were added into the Necromancer beta, and I'm going to be providing feedback on their concepts, not their numbers, because numbers are easy to tweak, but their concepts to make sure that we get the fantasy of these sets working correctly, and then we can, have the numbers tweaked later. But let's give feedback on how they perform, as far as are they enjoyable to use, or what can be tweaked to make them a bit easier to use, for example. Now, it's worth noting that all of these sets have placeholder names, so don't worry about that. We're going to be looking at the Plague set in this video in particular. And finally, just keep in mind that this is the beta, so things are subject to change. Now, the Plague set. Really interesting in concept to me. I really like it. It's probably the one I was least attracted to begin with, but it's one that I find myself drawn to because it is really cool. So the two-piece is every time you consume a corpse, you fire Corpse Lance at a nearby enemy. Now, Corpse Lance is simply a thing that you target an enemy for, and it just shoots a projectile and deals 900% weapon damage to that target. That's the base rune for it. It does consume a corpse, so that is how you spend your resource on that, essentially. And the two-piece is anytime you consume a corpse, it fires a Corpse Lance. So you can either do it by, you can like double up by consuming corpses with Corpse Lance, which I find interesting. Or you can just use Devour or any other thing that consumes corpses, like Corpse Explosion or anything like that, and it will fire a Corpse Lance. Now, Devour, by the way, it basically just devours a ton of corpses nearby. It's within a certain range, and then that gives you essence back, but then with the two-piece, it'll fire a Corpse Lance. So that's an interesting interaction. Personally, for me, I've been using the aura for Devour, which just consumes all corpses in an area around you just passively rather than you having to hit the button. So that ends up working really well with this 2-set. The 4-set bonus is each enemy you hit with Bone Spear reduces your damage taken by 2% to a maximum of 50%, and it lasts 15 seconds. This stacks up, so if you keep hitting one target over and over again, you're going to eventually get to that 50%. And then the 6-piece bonus is each corpse you consume grants an empowered Bone Spear charge that increases the damage of your next Bone Spear by 1,000%. So this whole idea, this whole concept of this set is to consume as many corpses as possible, to empower your Bone Spear, to have that as like your main damage source, right? Your Corpse Lance being thrown at enemies is just icing on the cake. The idea and the concept behind this is that your Bone Spear will be doing the majority of your damage. But the question here is, does Bone Spear live up to kind of having that fantasy of it being super empowered when you consume a corpse? Because again, the whole idea of this set is there's two pieces. You consume corpses, which fire a Corpse Lance, and then when you consume those corpses, you are also empowering your Bone Spear to do a ton of damage. But the problem is we're missing an auxiliary item that we don't have in the beta yet, at least that I have not been able to get, because you can't upgrade scythes to legendaries, which is it's a 2-handed scythe that when Bone Spikes, Bone Spear, and Bone Spirit, they deal 100% increased damage to enemies that are stunned, feared, charmed, frozen, and blinded. So having that item would help to fulfill that, and I think if we did have that item in the beta, or if I had it at least, it would increase the fantasy of having your Bone Spear do a ton of damage, and in turn make it way more satisfying to be consuming those corpses, to be firing Corpse Lances. And that's not the only item either, by the way. There's also a phylactery that is, your Bone Spear costs 40 essence, and deals 100% increased damage. Now, by itself, Bone Spear is 20 essence, and if you're using the Blood Rune, which I am, it also costs 10% health. I'll get to why I'm using that in a second, but with that phylactery, it makes it cost more, which is fine, because the way that I have this set up, I'm not really worrying about the cost, and it does 100% increased damage. So you can essentially get it, so Bone Spear is doing 200% increased damage to things that are frozen, charmed, feared, blinded, or stunned. And the stunned actually does make a lot of sense, because there is a passive called Bone Prison, which is Bone Spear, Bone Spikes, and Bone Spirit have a 10% chance to trap enemies in Bone Prison for 3 seconds, which I'm pretty sure does count as a stun of some description. So by that logic, it should be pretty easy to get the phylactery damage and the damage from the stun there. And I find that really interesting. It's a cool concept, but we don't have them, so it's hard to test. And the other problem is that the phylactery is obviously an offhand, and the two-handed scythe is a two-handed scythe. So you would have to have one of those in the cube. So what if you put the phylactery in the cube, then you're using a two-handed scythe. Or what you can do is you can use a one-handed scythe and possibly use one of the powers that they don't have yet. I'm not sure if there is going to be a one-handed scythe that, because there are several that they have where their powers aren't there yet, that maybe will go and increase your consume or your corpse lance damage, or maybe anytime you consume a corpse, something happens. And I think that interaction would then be really cool because you're getting the damage of Bone Scythe from the two-handed scythe in your cube. You're using a phylactery and a one-handed scythe to increase your corpse lance damage. And then you have a really cool interaction between all of the stuff on the set. So as far as my feedback is concerned, I really like the firing a corpse lance anytime you consume a corpse. I also really like that it empowers Bone Spear, because Bone Spear is not necessarily an item you're going to be using much outside of this set. It's compared to some of the other skills, it's not the best. But with this set, it is really, really good, especially with those potential items that increase that damage by a boatload. And then when you have the damage reduction on there, so anytime you pretty much hit with Bone Spear, you're increasing your damage reduction. That's always really nice to have on a set, because then you're not necessarily having to take a ton of damage reduction stuff either. And then that frees up a lot of skill choices as far as, what you're taking on runes, or what you're taking on passives, or what you're taking as far as rings and amulets are concerned. So I do feel that this set is a success. I think in its current form, it is fine and should not be touched. I also feel like we need to have the other items in order to fully change it, but changing the numbers right now are going to be useless until we get that two-handed scythe and the phylactery and a potential one-handed scythe to go with that phylactery. If we have all that stuff, then I think then you can start looking at what the numbers are doing. But as of right now, the set is really freaking fun to play, and you can see it on screen because of the interaction of the skills. So now let's talk about how I've decided, what skills to use here, because I think that is also very interesting. And of course, it's also interesting to see the process of why I took certain things, like how did I arrive at the conclusion to use these abilities, because that actually does inform what kind of message the set is sending as far as the set passives are concerned, the set bonuses. So obviously I'm using Bone Spear. So Bone Spear, I'm using the Blood Spear, which essentially it costs the 20 essence, but then it costs an additional 10% health to increase the damage. So instead of doing the, what's the base damage, 450% weapon damage, it's doing 518%. Obviously that can change in the future as far as numbers, but it also costs 10% health. We'll get to why I'm using health as a resource here. And then I am using Devour, which obviously, as I said earlier, is really nice because it devours the corpses. So that's how you're spending your corpses in order to throw corpse lance all over the place and empower your Bone Spear. And I'm using Devouring Aura because that means that I don't have to constantly be pushing that button to be throwing corpse lance. So I just have to run across where the corpses are. It automatically throws corpse lance, and I automatically get essence back, which means I can then spend it using Bone Spear, which means I don't need a generator, right? So that's a really clever way of taking care of that. I'm also using the Corpse Lance rune, so I'm putting Corpse Lance on my bar. You don't need to do this for the set to work, but I am because I want to use Blood Lance. Now, Corpse Lance, again, does 900% weapon damage to the target. And obviously, if you're consuming those corpses, it's going to be shooting them out at your target anyways. But I'm using the Corpse Lance Blood Lance rune because it spends 5% of my total health to launch an additional lance from myself towards the target that deals 300% weapon damage. So I have one doing 900%, I have one doing 300%, but there's 2 Bone Spears for every corpse that I do. So it's actually a pretty nice bonus there, but it does spend life. Now I'm also using the Simulacrum, which I think that's how you say it, which is essentially, it replicates whatever essence spenders you're using for 15 seconds, and Bone Spear is an essence spender. So it'll basically throw 2 bone spears instead of just 1. And that is on a 120-second cooldown. And to pair with that, I also have another 120-second cooldown, which is Land of the Dead, which is all corpse skills can be used at will for 10 seconds. So it's as if there are infinite corpses around you. So if I throw that down and I have Devouring Aura on, it will devour an infinite amount of corpses around me, as much as it can in whatever area that I have that Devouring Aura, because it will increase based on my health globe pickup radius. So essentially my aura is consuming the corpses from Land of the Dead, which is where I'm getting my corpses from. I've tried using the golem to create corpses, and I think that's an interesting interaction, but I don't think it's necessary because you can get so much cooldown reduction from this build because of a passive called, what is it, Life from Death? No, Blood is Power. Blood is Power is every 5% health that you lose reduces the remaining cooldowns by 1%, all remaining cooldowns. So it's not like the Obsidian Ring, which is just a random skill by 1%. It's all cooldowns by 1%. But on top of that, I also have Obsidian Ring in the cube. The idea here is I'm trying to keep as close to 100% uptime on Land of the Dead and Simulacrum as possible. And by using both Obsidian Ring and Blood is Power, I am reducing the cooldowns by a stupid amount, because all of my corpse lances that are being fired out because my Devouring Aura on top of the Land of the Dead, it's reducing my health. And this is a really important interaction here, because if you do not use Simulacrum with the rune, the Blood Debt rune, which is a placeholder rune, and I don't know if this is a placeholder effect, but its life costs of skills are reduced by 75% while it's active. So essentially, if I use Land of the Dead, and I have the Corpse Lance rune, which spends health in order to use it, and I'm using Devour in order to devour all of those corpses, the interaction here is really important, because if you're not using Simulacrum, you're just going to like instantly die, because it's just going to spend all of your health. With Simulacrum, it means that you don't instantly die. It reduces that damage you're taking, and essentially you can keep yourself alive. But then you might ask yourself, how am I keeping myself alive despite the fact that I'm draining all of my HP constantly, even with a reduced amount? And that's because there is a Life from Death passive. Consuming a corpse has a 20% chance to spawn a health globe. And because you're constantly consuming corpses, you're constantly spawning life globes. That's what keeps your health up. And I like that interaction. I think it's a really cool and really fun. Plus, if you're using Reaper's Wraps, which I am, which I don't think are necessary for this build to work, but if you are using them, that is also providing an infinite amount of essence for you to constantly be throwing Bone Spear out. So the way I'm playing this build is I'll run in and get, a bit of enemies together, and then I will Land of the Dead and Simulacrum, and then I'll just sit there and be throwing out millions of corpse lances because of Devour constantly throwing those out for me. I don't have to worry about pushing any button. Devour and corpse lance on my bars are essentially passives. And then I'm just throwing the Bone Spear with the Blood Spear rune, because that's reducing my health too, which, because of the Blood is Power passive, is reducing my cooldowns on Land of the Dead and Simulacrum, which means I can try to have those up at 100% uptime or close enough to it. Close enough to it that if I can kill a ton of things with the first launch of all that nonsense, then I am able to use those corpses on the ground from that to keep me going until Land of the Dead and Simulacrum are back up. As far as the other 2 passives are concerned, they're pretty easy to switch in and out, but I find that Standalone is really good, because if you use it, increases your armor by 100%, and it reduces it by 10% for each active minion, which you're not using any minions, so it's actually really, really nice to have to keep up your damage reduction. And by the way, as far as the last skill is concerned, I found this to be pretty easy to switch out for anything that you want to try to use. I've tried Bone Armor, it worked well. I've tried Blood Rush, that worked really well, because you tend to get yourself in a bit of a pickle, I would say, a lot of the time, especially because you can't really move through enemies unless you're using those illusory boots or whatever they're called, which allow you to freely move through enemies. And then you know, you can also try things like Death Nova. I think that's an interesting idea because there is an item in the cube that I haven't been able to get yet, which is anytime that you consume a corpse, you unleash a free Death Nova. And I think that's really, really cool. But if you had that item, which is a two-handed scythe as well, it means that you can't necessarily also use the other two-handed scythe for Bone Spear or the Phylactery for Bone Spear. So I don't think it's meant to work together with it, but it is also an option. And I think that might be kind of cool if you had the Death Nova on your bars and then you were using possibly the one that costs health, so the Blood Nova. That's also an interesting idea. But there's a couple other things that you can do. You could try Army of the Dead. Maybe that would work really well as kind of a try to blow the guy up. Command Golem works really well because then you can use the Flesh Golem to throw down more bodies and use those as corpses. You can use any of the curses. The curses work really well for this too, especially if you're kind of low on a lot of HP. You could try Leech. That would work out pretty well. But that's pretty much what I've decided would work really well for that. You can also just use Corpse Explosion if that seems interesting enough. But the way that I have went about kind of reaching the conclusion of using these abilities is that Land of the Dead and Simulacrum are really powerful in combination with Devour, because it gives you an infinite amount of corpses to summon in order to give you an infinite amount of stacks on your Bone Spear, because it goes up to 30 from what I can tell. And you're never going to use all of those in any given situation. So it gives you kind of it makes the 6-piece bonus not whenever you have consumed a corpse. It turns it basically into it just deals 1,000% increased damage. The issue I'm seeing here is without those two items to increase the Bone Spear damage, Bone Spear feels very lackluster. And I've determined that it's because of two various things. The first is that it just doesn't do enough damage. Either you need those items or the set bonus doesn't increase it enough. Or, alternatively, Bone Spear feels like it's too thin. Anytime I throw it, it doesn't feel fun to throw. I feel like it should, right? If I feel like Bone Spear should be a really cool, meaty ability that when you throw it, it should feel like you're doing a lot of damage. And the piercing part of it should really feel like it is piercing through enemies, right? But when I throw it, it just kind of feels like I'm throwing confetti out. And with the two items to increase the damage, that may increase the feeling of it feeling better. But I think the root cause of it is that it is too thin. I think if it was wider, the Bone Spear would feel like it does a bit more because you're hitting more enemies with it, obviously, which would increase its utility because of the AoE. Now, I know that balance on that might be interesting because, you have plenty of other AoE abilities, and this is not necessarily meant to be like a mass clearing ability, but if it was a little wider, I feel like it would feel like you're throwing more of a Bone Spear, because it's also really easy to lose in the herpes of all the screen effects that are going on, because it is such a thin little ability. Another spear that would actually work really well is the Teeth, which essentially is just like a big AoE in front of you. See, that one feels good to hit the button for because it has a cool effect, right? But it also feels like it does a lot on the screen. It feels like you're hitting a lot of enemies as opposed to like throwing like a really... It's kind of like Impale. The issue with Impale on Demon Hunters is you throw it and it does a lot of damage when you're using that shadow set, which is awesome. But it just doesn't feel like you can hit enough enemies with it. And it's kind of frustrating unless you're trying to only throw one at a time at an enemy. And then obviously if you have the quiver, then you're throwing 3 of them, and that feels a lot better. But it's just because Bone Spear is so thin on all of the other runes other than Teeth, it doesn't feel like you're really throwing too much of a big ability at people. But just to reiterate, it's hard to evaluate the value of Bone Spear because we don't have those 2 items. I haven't been able to use those 2 items. If I had them and it was doing more damage, would it still feel like it's not fun to throw? Maybe. And that's why I'm thinking like maybe it's because it's too thin and the projectile should be slightly wider, or maybe it is that simply it's not doing enough damage. I think the easiest course of action here is obviously to wait until we get those items to try it out. And then if I feel like it's doing a lot more damage and I'm having fun throwing it, like I'm kind of like throwing a javelin at people and doing a ton of damage, then maybe that would be a lot better than just increasing the width. So it's just one of those considerations that you have to have. But to conclude my thoughts and kind of wrap them up, I feel like the Plague set is really cool. It is in the right direction. It is handling cool abilities that you don't necessarily get to use often because they're not necessarily as efficient as other ones that you have while leveling up. And it definitely uses different abilities than what you would consider using if you were using some of the other sets, like the Blood set, for example. And the way that the interactions work with Land of the Dead and Simulacrum and just being able to infinitely consume corpses, as the Plague set is concerned, it definitely, I feel, it definitely lives up to the fantasy of just consuming a ton of corpses and empowering Bone Spear. Now, one thing that I want to try that I haven't yet to try is because it is called the Plague set, what would happen if I just used all poison abilities? That might be a little bit more interesting, but the issue I'd run into is that I don't think I would have the cooldown reduction anymore to keep Land of the Dead and Simulacrum up. And I feel like that might be really important to having this set feel really cool. But, you know, it's so many different possibilities with skill combinations that I'm sure someone else has tried it. We'll have to kind of see what they feel about it. But when it boils down to how I like playing this, it's just shoot as many corpse spears as possible, because I feel like that is, or corpse lance rather, because I feel like that is the cool part of the set. That is the really satisfying part to me, is throwing as many corpse lances as possible, and the way I do that is by consuming a ton of corpses from Land of the Dead and keeping myself alive from Simulacrum, because I'm reducing the cooldowns through my passives. But other than those thoughts, I feel like the set is really, really good, and I'm going to continue to use it, and it might be one of my favorite ones so far, just based on how satisfying it is to consume all the corpses. With that being said, though, that's my feedback. That's my breakdown of the set. Let me know if you are interested in this set or any of the other ones that I'll put up videos on. But until next time, we shall see you guys next time.